So that's a big range. What that means is we have to go to other data. We have to get other sources of information to inform us about what the natural rate of unemployment is. And what are those other sources of information we can turn to? So the basic intuition when you're looking for other sources of information is the intuition I used when I talked about the natural rate of unemployment to begin with. The natural rate of unemployment is low relative to the observed unemployment rate if nominal rigidities are keeping demand low. So what we need is information about the state of demand. And if we get that information, then we'll be on our way to figuring out more about the gap between natural rate of unemployment and the unemployment rate. So one piece of information is survey evidence. There are various surveys of businesses about the impediments to job creation. In particular, the National Federation of Independent Business has some questions it asks its members about this. Reserve Bank presidents is what we do. We ask business people about these kinds of questions all the time. What seems to be causing low job creation for you? What I find when I ask these questions, or I look at these surveys, is insufficient demand shows up first as an answer, and then there are concerns expressed about taxes and regulation. And this is very loose evidence, but it does suggest that while the natural rate of unemployment may have risen in the last 3 years, it's still low relative to the observed unemployment rate. I think a more compelling piece of information is in inflation itself. And here, talking about somewhat crude inflation heuristics. And by crude, I'm going to mean unsophisticated. I won't mean off color. So the unemployment rate, if the gap between the unemployment rate and the natural rate of unemployment is high, then nominal rigidities are pushing down demand. And this should be shown up somehow in inflation. If we're having this depressed demand, the nominal rigidity should be pushing demand down in some fashion. And so we should be able to see that in inflation itself. The basic idea is a very simple one. If you have low demand, we should see downward pressure on inflation. Now, the problem with this is always it depends on the exact model. It depends on the exact model of price setting you have, the exact model of expectations, how the sluggishness that I describe actually plays out. But I'll describe two different kinds of models here, and I'll talk about how that works. So the older models that are out there, macroeconomic models, the gap between unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment is high when inflation is low, relative to past inflation. So what matters is how is inflation changing over time. The newer models developed in the last 10 or 15 years, the gap between the observed unemployment rate and the natural rate is high when inflation is low relative to the expectations. They're more forward-looking, so they're relative to the expectations of inflation. So this symbol here refers to the expectations of inflation. Now, it's challenging if these two approaches, the older models and newer models, give you different answers. Right now, that's not the case. These models, all these models, however you look at the inflation data, you get the same answer out. In the second half of 2010, core PCE inflation was 0.5%, 50 basis points. And I should say on the slide, at an annualized rate. This is pretty much the lowest observation that we've seen for this series in the last 50 years. It's low compared to the previous observations of core PCE inflation. And it's low compared to future core PCE inflation, which is expected to be in the low ones during 2011. So both new and old models suggest that the gap between unemployment rate and the natural rate is significantly positive. Okay, so here what we're doing is going to inflation, trying to infer the state of demand from inflation, and then using that to back out, figure out something about the gap between unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment. So let me wrap up here. Is high unemployment mainly due to nominal rigidities, or is it mainly due to other factors? That's the question that confronts us as monetary policymakers. And the problem is the aggregate data on unemployment and vacancies just aren't definitive on this. And so you can't look at those data alone because you end up with a wide range of possible answers when you look at that data. If you look at other data, you look at survey data, you look at inflation data, those data imply that the gap between the observed unemployment rate and the natural rate of unemployment is, in fact, significantly positive. I mean, that tells you, that translates into the policy conclusion that it's appropriate for monetary policy to be highly accommodative as it is. What about in the future? So in the future, I think there are good reasons to expect both the unemployment rate, as we the observed unemployment rate, and the natural rate to fall. So you have both these variables falling. It doesn't really tell you about what's happening to the gap between them. And that's going to remain a challenging question. What's going to happen to the difference between these as we go forward? And that raises the question, when will the FOMC need to cut back on its current level of accommodation? And the Federal Market Committee is going to continue to reevaluate. There'll be new information coming online, coming to us, and we'll have to continue reevaluating this question about whether or the appropriateness of our monetary policy stance. In that exercise, I myself will be paying close attention to the behavior of core inflation. Just as I described to you, core inflation has a lot of information about the state of demand. That seems to be the right variable to be looking at if we want to be figuring out what this gap is between unemployment and the natural rate. I'm out of slides. Thank you very much.